In this video, we will look at using a benchmark of 1/2 to compare two fractions. So if you notice that two fractions are somewhat close to a half, in other words, the numerator is close to half of the denominator. It might be a little bit more, it might be a little bit less, but that the fraction is close to half, then you may be able to reason about how close the fractions are to a half or how they compare to 1/2, and then be able to make a conclusion about how they compare to each other. So here's an example: 11/24 and 15/28. So if you take a look at each of them, they are not close to 0, they're not close to 1/2, but they are both somewhere close to the middle, 1/2. So think about half of 24 would be 12. So 12/24 would be a half, and 11/24 then would be very close to 1/2. Looking at the other fraction, 28, half of 28 is 14. So 14/28 would be a half, and so 15/28 is close to a half. So looking at this comparison visually and using 1/2 as a benchmark, we can see I have made rectangles to represent wholes, right? The long rectangle is one whole. And since we're using 1/2 as a benchmark, I've marked off the 1/2 point in each of those rectangles. And looking at 11/24, remember that 12/24 would be 1/2, and so 11/24 is just a little piece less than half. 15/28 is just a little bit more than half, because 14/28 would be a half. So I've marked 15/28 being a little bit more than 1/2, just one piece more than a half. And so if we shade in 11/24 and 15/28, we can clearly see that 15/28 must be larger. It is more than half, while 11/24 is less than half. So we can write it this way then: 11/24 is less than 15/28. Here's another example: 7/12 and 9/16. Again, these are not close to 0. They're not really even close to 1/2, but we do notice that the numerator is close to being about half of the denominator. So 7/12 is 1/12 away from a half, while 9/16 is 1/16 away from a half. So 6/12 would be a half, we have 7/12. 8/16 would be half, and we have 9/16. Now in this case, they are both over half, so we're going to have to use a little bit more reasoning about the size of the pieces. So let's take a look. Again, I've made a rectangle for each whole, and I've been careful to make them the same size so that we're working with the same size whole. So I've also marked the 1/2 mark in both of those. So 7/12, again, 6/12 is a half, and then we have one more 12th. 8/16 is half, and so 9/16 has one more 16th. Now we know that 16ths are smaller parts than 12ths. And so what that means, we can see here visually that 7/12 must be greater than 9/16. They both go over half, but 7/12 goes over half by a larger piece. And so we can write it this way: 7/12 is greater than 9/16.